Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rigo Villa. I'm one of the community managers on the Cisco Learning Network, and I'll be your host today. In this session, we will be covering device administration with ISE with our speaker and presenter, Emmanuel Cano. But before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, I do want to let our attendees know that if we run into any technical issues during the webinar, we'll do our very best to resolve it as soon as possible. So we just want to thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Next, if you have any questions during the session, we ask that you please post them in the question and answer panel, as that would help our panelists manage and keep track of all of your questions and would also allow them to provide you with a much more timely response. Also, if you experience any audio streaming issues during the live presentation, I do recommend using the call-in telephone number that I'm going to be posting in the chat window here in just a moment. And at the end of this webinar, you're going to get a pop-up survey with a couple of questions about today's presentation. And we would really appreciate it if you can just take a moment to fill it out and share with us any thoughts or feedback that you may have about today's session. I also want to let our attendees know that this webinar will be recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing within approximately 5 business days after today. And I'll be sure to share some more information about that in the chat window a little bit later on. And last but not least, I want to let everyone know about our upcoming ISE webinars. So our next session is coming up this Thursday, October 5th, and we're going to be covering live ISE Q&A. And then for the month of November, we're going to present upgrading ISE in the cloud with automation, and that's going to be on Tuesday, November 7th. And I'm going to be sharing some information a little bit later on about how you can register for these upcoming sessions as well. And without any further delay, I am now going to turn it over to our speaker to get us started. So, Emmanuel, if you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Rigo. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another ISE webinar. My name is Emmanuel Cano. I'm security consulting engineer, and today I want to talk to you about device administration with ISE. Even though we might think that we can achieve device administration using TACACS, well, there are a couple of considerations, couple of options that we also have while we are thinking about device administration, even using Radius. And I think that's one of the most important part to show today. And that's why I decided to start with the very basic of TACACS. Part of the agenda will also cover difference between TACACS and Radius. I think this is important to better understand how much we can do between TACACS and Radius for device administration. Again, we are going to have an overview of Radius, have an overview of TACACS, what are its elements, and we will also be talking about single connect, and we are going to have a couple of demos showing you how to achieve TACACS server with using external ISE. In my case, it's going to be ISE, but you can pretty much use any other server. And but last but not least, we will be using TACACS with Duo. For sure, these two points we're going to cover in details using demo so that you can see how easy it is to configure, how you can troubleshoot, and what are the elements for each one of them. Let's start with the basic of TACACS. And before even talk about TACACS as a protocol and talk about ISE as our main TACACS server, let's take a look at how it was used, or what was the options that we had in the past using Radius and CLI access. So in the past, we had something called role-based CLS access, also known as parser view. And what we had to do as network administrators was to configure what we call a view so that we can use
so
the
you got
commands
a file server
and restrict the commands per user. Even though it was functional by restricting the particular user or users using specific commands, like I have it on my example in the console, it comes to the scalability, and the way that we had to configure was one by one. So that was one of the main challenges that we had to face. as administrators. So configuring one by one was very time consuming, and that could also lead on not a scalable solution. So even though we can use it, it was time consuming and it was not the best option for us. Fortunately, after some time, we came across with Terminal Access Control System Plus, or TACACS for short. This is one of the most used protocols for our network administrators and for our customers to manage devices and to manage who is going to get access to which device for Cisco and even for third party. For those who don't know, we can also use TACACS, we can also use Radius for devices who are not part of Cisco. That's incredibly useful. But before getting into the details, let's talk about the differences and the main considerations while we need to choose Radius versus TACACS for device admin. This is very traditional slide where we use to see what are the ports, what are the encryption methods, but essentially it tells us what are the main options or what are the main considerations to take into account every time that we need to use combined authentication or authorization, which is the case of Radius. Or if we really need to separate authentication, authorization, and accounting, then we need to choose TACACS for that purpose. We also have encryption differences. While Radius could encrypt only the password, on TACACS, we have the ability to encrypt the entire body of the packet. TACACS protocol behaves quite different. That's why most of the cases we need to use TACACS for that. The main difference, as stated in the last row, we can see the command authorization. For many of us network and network users who are going to get access to the network and to network devices, we need to keep in mind that we can also restrict which type of commands we are going to use or which type of commands every single person who is going to get access to the network will be using. And that's entirely possible using TACACS. While on Radius, we can allow the user to get into the network or the network device as such, but we are limited to allowed only permit all or deny because we don't have the granularity as with TACACS. So talking about device administration with Radius, which is the first option that we used to have. And I could say some of the customers and some of the solutions still using it. Basically, when we talk about device administration with Radius, we need to think and we need to consider three main points. The first point relies on the verification of the network device to support Radius. Radius is widely adopted. It's widely supported by many network devices, Cisco and third party. And it is important for us to start looking at the dictionaries, start looking at the attributes that we may use in order to use Radius or to configure Radius for device administration. Second, we have to create what we call the authorization profile, which is basically the set of permissions that we are going to send upon the authentication and upon on a authorization part. And here we have the ability to create the user, also user role, and the privilege along with the vendor attributes. As I mentioned, Radius supports Cisco and third-party devices, and that's why we need to consider the dictionaries and the attributes that we need to send. If for some reason we don't send the correct attribute, then it's not going to be possible to have access to the network device. This is important to remember. Last but not least, after we created the authorization part, it's time for us to create the ISE policy sets. the authentication, and for sure the authorization policy. All of this can be done under the Radius policy section. And after that, we can configure the network device as we are doing normal ISE and configuration for AAA. One of the advantages, and I think this is very important for ISE and for many of us who are working with ISE every single day, one of the advantages that ISE provides is the ability to not only have support for Cisco devices, but also to manage other vendors' devices. In addition, we also have the ability to configure network devices not only for CLI, but user interface. For example, we can configure A5 to be able to send the traffic of the request to ISE. And by using the correct attributes, we can limit the user or the administrator to certain menus and certain tabs. Or on the other side, we can have Huawei devices, for example, just authenticating against ISE and have the specific permissions based on what we have configured in ISE. Another example, we can use Juniper, again, using attributes on their authorization profile. We can set up and we can define what type of the permission this administration will have. And last but not least, we could have Cisco. There are some solutions for Cisco that would not support TACACS at the moment, but we can still be able to authenticate the users via externally using ISE, again, using advanced attributes. In this example, this device is a firewall device. It can be authenticated and we can externally authenticate the user by the Cisco IP pair. One point to discuss, one point to consider is that with every single attribute, we need to review and we need to double check the documentation for all the vendor that we want ISE to authenticate with. That's all I wanted to talk about device administration with TACACS, with Radius. Let's talk about now device administration with TACACS, which is now the preferred method due to the granularity, the flexibility, and the security that this protocol provides. And under TACACS, we need to understand the three main or the three pillars for the configuration. Being the first one, the allow protocols, which means what are the protocol or protocols we are going to support in order to receive and to handle the request. By default, we can use allow PAP ASCII, but we can also use allow CHAP or MS-CHAP version 1. It is important for us to understand that even if we can enable it and ISE supports it, those protocols are not secure, especially MS-CHAP version 1. So we need to consider to migrate to support protocols. Okay? CHAP is also well used, and then again, we need to consider only use the preferred one, which is PAP ASCII, and review the commands and the documentation for the network device. We also have the command set. In this case, we are allowing or we are denying the network admin to type any specific or a set of specific commands. With command set, we can permit, for example, the configuration terminal while denying the rest of the configuration. We have this granularity on TACACS, and even though we set up the permission for the network administrator to be privilege 15, which is the highest level, we can still support and we can still limit the commands that this network administrator could type. One additional option, and this is a very cool option for ISE, is that we can use regex. So if we don't know or we don't want to eliminate or to limit specific commands or just restrict for a specific set of commands, we can also use regex, and we are going to see this in one of the demos actually. And last but not least, we also need to think about shell profile. With shell profile, as we can see on the image, we can provide the network administrator with the privilege upon the authentication and as part of the authorization part. We can set up the privilege based on the role. For example, if we want to differentiate between network operator versus network admin or super admin, and we can have a mix of shell profile and command set. We can have one user with 15 or the privilege of 15, but we can restrict this endpoint or this network device and network administrator to manage this device only with certain commands. Okay. With regards of network TACACS or the TACACS that we need to keep into consideration, we need to for sure enable the device admin service. One of the main problems when we start talking about, when we start implementing TACACS, is the ability to receive the request, process the request, and send this specific permission or this specific privilege. Before we start with the testing phase, we need to make sure that this service under administration system deployment is enabled. Otherwise, we are not going to have any response back from ISE. Second part that we need to consider is that we need to have enough licenses to be able to perform device administration. And the way that we are going to identify and make sure we have the license is by going to NAV administration system, but in this case, we are going to need to click on licensing menu. Let's remember that beginning and starting on ISE 3.0, we are going to need to register our ISE with the smart licensing. This does not support path file anymore. So once we register our ISE, we should see our device administration consumption as 1, depending on the number of nodes. In my case, I'm only using one node, hence the only one node is only one license is needed as of now. This is from ISE perspective. What about the network device itself? Well, in my case, I'm going to use ASA and a router for my demos. And I wanted to show you the basic configuration that I'm going to use today in order to configure ASA for device administration with ISE. And I will want to start with the command for the reload, which is, in my opinion, one of the best practice or the quick tip I will tell you, and I will always recommend to my customers. What the reload command does is to set up the time in minutes, in my case 15 minutes. And if for some reason I lose connectivity or I lose access to the device, even though I'm not configured all the commands, I'm not saving the commands, when this command will save me by reload the device in the certain time that I've set up. In my case 15 minutes, but it can be like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Okay? There's going to be another option that I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But for now, we have configured, or we should configure the global this command in global mode, and then continue with adding ISE using the interface where we should be receiving or we should be sending the information in case of the TACACS request. And we need to make sure that we enable local authentication for SSH or for console. Another tip that I could give you is that before starting with the authorization part, you have the ability to test authentication. If the authentication fails, then that means that the authorization will fail as well. So before going to authorization commands, I recommend you to use the command test AAA authentication number or the name of the ISE group, and then just type any user that you could also use to test the connectivity and to test the authentication part for ISE before moving on to authorization part. Here is the configuration. This is the configuration I'm going to use on my demo, but I wanted to show you how easy and how many commands do we need to set up our ASA for device admin. Yes, in this case, when it comes to iOS, well, we have a little bit more of commands. However, the configuration looks pretty similar. We also have the ability to enable the reload command. Again, 15 minutes is my time, but you could set it up as 10, 5, or any time that you prefer. We need to add as a TACACS server, add AAA and then authentication commands. Another tip that was that I think it's also useful and was provided to me, and I think it's very good idea. Instead of pointing the TACACS the authentication commands to ISE group first, we can also use local as the first list to be used for the authentication. That way, we can test the authentication, and if that works, then we can move to the group from local to ISE. Okay, that's another tip. And for sure, all the best practices and all these commands will serve to test before implement this in production. Okay. As with ASA, we have console commands. In my case, I'm using the line BTY, but also you can implement this on the console. We need to have the authorization commands. And the reason why I'm using those authorization commands at the end is because as soon as you implement the authorization commands, these requests will be sent to ISE. So if you don't configure ISE with the specific permissions for this user, you may need or you might not be able to continue with the configuration. And again, before configure anything on production or before configure the authorization commands, you can use your good friend test AAA group to test the authentication against ISE in real time. So this it's pretty much what I'm going to use in my demo, as I said, and many of us have worked or will be working to set up not only one iOS or not only one ASA at a time. We are going to, or we need to think about different options when it comes to configuring different iOS or different devices. And every single request will be sent to ISE as part of the granularity, as I said at the beginning of the presentation. That means that every single request will be logged and will be shown in the TACACS live logs. So we need to think about the amount of information we'll be getting to ISE as part of the TACACS configuration. One of the options that we have in order to improve the performance when it comes to the communication between ISE and the network devices is something called a single connect. So single connect is one of the features that allows us to group one of the authentication, for example, the login and different messages in a single three-way handshake. In this case, we can have a look at the three-way handshake login. Then we have the login. We have another three-way handshake just for the authentication, and so on, so on. In this case, every time that we interact with the device and sending traffic to TACACS, which means ISE, we are going to see the three-way handshake. So basically, single connect allows us to use a single TCP connections for all TACACS communication between ISE and the network device. Here is how it looks like after we enable this feature. So basically, we are the number of three-way handshake. Okay, and this is also improving the performance as such. Just another example, we are using 3-in-1 handshake with authentication, in this case for command authentication, and another set of 3-in-1 handshake with accounting command authentication. Sorry, accounting command. In this case, by using single connect, we are also allowing this part of the 3-in-1 handshake to be set it up and to stick in one single 3-in-1 handshake communication by every transaction instead of have one 3-in-1 handshake per command. Okay, how we set it up, how we configure it, it's just by using two different configuration, in this case with ISE. And one important part is that we have a single connect support enabled by default, starting on ISE 2.6 and above. So if you have a look at single connect support located on the Work Center device administration settings, here you will gonna see the single connect support already enabled. On the other side, once we configure this on our network devices, we have the ability to enable single connect mode on network resources, network devices. Even though this is a pretty straightforward process, we also need to enable it from the network device as well. So here is the command. This is in this case on a router, but you can also enable it on the switch. And the way that we enable it is by using the TACACS server, which means inside the TACACS server, or while we are configuring ISE and adding the ISE IP address, we can enable this single connect connection. Okay? My advice, and according to what different different tests and with my experience with our customers, I always recommend to test this in different scenarios, different devices, and for sure it's always recommended to test this in the lab before going to production. But again, this is one of the features that we can use and we can take advantage while we are configuring TACACS. Okay, talking about TACACS, we have our first option, and the first option for TACACS in this case is something called external TACACS server. So in this case, what I'm using here is one of the scenarios when a customer would like to migrate from one ISE while keep both of them online. Here is one of the best options that I could provide, or we can test. You can also test in your environment. In this case, I'm using two ISE, okay, one being the proxy for the second one. And we need to enable basically, or we need to consider basically three pillars. First pillar is that the network access device will need to be registered on ISE1 only, okay? Or the part of the communication that will occur between ISE1 and ISE2 will go directly to ISE2 by adding ISE1 as network access device, okay? In my case, ISE1 will be the NAT on ISE2, and ISE2 will be registered or will join the Active Directory. The Active Directory will not be joined on ISE2, I'm sorry, on ISE1, but will be on ISE2. And the communication back will be the same, being the Active Directory will send the traffic to ISE2. ISE2 will communicate with ISE1, and ISE1 will provide this information on the privilege or the access accept, access reject to the network device. As simple as that. In my case, I'm going to use ISE 3.3 and ISE 3.2, okay, to show you how easy it is to configure the authentication using ISE TACACS server. Okay, here's my lab. It's a simple Active Directory. And here I'm going to use ASA and one of the users that I've created previously to show you here. As you can see, I wanted to share again at the very from scratch, very simple step. Here I have my my user part of the Active Directory, and I'm going to use Active Directory join into the in my environment. So here's my ISE 3.3, so pretty new. I'm using dark mode. I really love that mode, by the way. And the first thing that I'm going to set up is the network device group. So it's a best practice for me in order to test specific devices. And here I'm going to use the network device as firewall because I'm going to use that. Okay. Next step is using network devices menu to add my ASA. Okay, I'm typing the IP address and I'm going to enable TACACS. Okay, please make sure that you record the share secret because you are going to need to type the same share secret on the ASA. One more thing, don't forget to add the ASA on the network device group. In this case, network device type as firewalls, and we are pretty much it. So as of now, we are adding the network access device on ISE number 1. Okay, and the next step is to configure the external server. So the external server, it will be ISE number 2. And here we are going to need to type or to define a name. Okay, ISE external in my case, I'm going to type ISE number 2 IP address. Okay, I'm going to leave the command connection port and timeout as default, set it up the share secret, and that's it. Okay, that's for setting up and to define the external server. Then I need to go to TACACS server sequence. In this case, it's going to be the list of the servers, external servers IS1 will look into it. Since I only have one, well, I'm going to be able to only add one. Here's the important part. We have local accounting and remote accounting. In this case, I'm enabling local and remote so that you can see the TACACS logs in both ISE1 and the next step is to configure a policy set, but rather than configure it, the profiles and the command set, I'm going to use the policy set to redirect the traffic to my ISE number 2. Okay, everything that I've configured so far belongs to ISE number 1. So, and in this case, I'm going to use the device type of firewalls that I previously configured and use the sequence, okay, proxy sequence, which is TACACS underscore sequence from the menu. In this case, I'm going to use 3.2 as my ISE number 2, but it should work the same with ISE version 3.3. Okay. As we saw on the slide, in this case, I'm going to use ISE number 1 as my network access device. Hence, I need to add it. I'm not going to add my switch or my router, in this case, my ASA. I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use ISE number 1 as my network access device. I'll make sure to copy and paste the same IP address so I don't make any mistake here. And I'm going to enable, okay? I'll need to enable TACACS as well, okay? Let's see if I have the same IP address, go to TACACS, good, and type the same share secret that I defined previously while I was configuring the external TACACS server on ISE number 1. Okay, that's it. And after that, I think we can go directly to the let's see. Yeah, I just wanted to show you that in my case, ISE number 2 is already joined. Okay, has successful connectivity with my Active Directory, the on-prem Active Directory, and I fetch the 2 groups that I'm going to use, especially one of them for my ASA user. Okay, go to the external identity service. Okay, and as we can see, this Active Directory, this ISE is not joined with Active Directory, only ISE number 2, right? The next part is to configure the TACACS elements. Here I'm going to use two elements that we previously saw. This is TACACS command set and TACACS profile. In TACACS command set, I'm going to use a main full name, in my case ASA, because we are going to use for ASA. And I'm going to click on permit any command that is not listed below. This option will allow me to type any command and all the commands will be permitted. Next, I'm going to use TACACS profile. And as mentioned previously, I'm going to use default privilege as 15. That means that I'm going to get the privilege 15 and I'm going to have all the permission for all the commands. Okay, I'm configuring policy set in this section, and I'm going to use one of the conditions, which is the TACACS. Or well, let's configure a different thing. Let me configure the IP address. Okay, so you can see that it also works with IP address. So in this case, I'm not configuring the IP address from the ASA as such. I'm configuring the IP address of ISE number 1. Again, everything in regards to the communication will be between ISE 1 and ISE 2. Okay. For the authentication part, I'm going to use the same. I'm going to use something by default. Here, I don't have any specific option to configure, but under authorization, I'm going to use one external AD group, in this case, the user. Okay? And I'm going to select the command set and the shell profile. I've configured it in the elements section. Okay, good. I think that's it. Next step is to monitor and to test this configuration with my ASA. So here, I'm going to put it both options, the TACACS live logs on ISE 1 and ISE 2. So you see the same log in both ISE. And now it's time for me to configure the ASA. So I just see on the right side, the commands that I have is pretty much the same set of commands that I put on the slides. So this is the best way for me to show you that this command actually worked, okay? And before configuring, I just want to show you that we are going to start from scratch by typing the reload. So as I mentioned, we need to enable it in global configuration mode, and that it's going to give us 15 minutes to configure it. Okay? So then let's go ahead. Let's continue by configuring ISE. Okay, share secret. Remember, we need to make sure that this same share secret we configure on ASA, it needs to be configured on ISE, right? Before we continue with the configuration, let's test our username. In this case, I put my user as ASA user. The authentication is successful. Okay, and we are going to see both authentication. Okay, it's coming on on ISE number 1, and the same should be on ISE number 2 as we see it. Okay, this option is for us to confirm that the configuration comes to ISE 1 and from ISE 1 to ISE 2, and we can also confirm that the communication is going from 1 to 2 and it's forwarding the request from ISE 1 to 2, right? So let's go here, and I think it's good enough that we can configure it. And in this case, I'm using the no AAA authentication SSH console because I previously configured the SSH to authenticate against the local database. So if this is your case, then we need to remove that one before configure the AAA authentication SSH to point to ISE instead of the local authentication. Okay. So let's continue with it. And let me see if I can remove it. This one here, and configure the authentication. Okay. And add the AAA commands to point to ISE for authorization part. Okay, that's it. And at this moment, we are going to test our user one more time, setting up a different SSH session using ASA user one and put the same credentials in there. Okay, and we should be able to see both authentications on both ISE. Okay. One thing to note is that if we don't want to see the logs on both ISE, it's important for us to disable the option to only show the accounting information on the second ISE instead of the remote server instead of the local server. Okay, I just did it for both, so you can see the both logs on both ISE, but this is entirely optional for you. Okay, that's the first demo I wanted to show you. Then let's go to the next demo. And I think this is pretty interesting and pretty something that we have seen in our teams and something that we are looking for, we should looking for. In this case, the TACACS with Duo for multi-factor authentication is something that it's possible for now and something that is very easy to configure. And for the different users that we should have access, the different network administrators, all the administrators should have access to one or more network devices. However, it is important to implement an additional authentication method apart from username and password, even though we are using Active Directory credentials. And one of the best options to use we call TACACS with Duo for MFA. In this a scenario, I'm using Ubuntu. I'm not using Windows because I wanted to show you how easy it is to configure the Ubuntu as the Duo proxy. Okay, and this Duo authentication proxy will be used against the cloud service Duo, so that it can communicate. And again, the Duo authentication proxy will also be in communication with the Active Directory. So here's pretty much the communication, and the goal is to provide the username with the ability to authenticate with username and password, but also to implement or to enhance the security by adding an additional authentication layer. But in this case, I didn't want to go over the theory. Rather, I wanted to show you directly on the demo because I believe this is very important for us to understand. And in this case, I'm back to my Active Directory. Okay. And one of the options, one of the first point that I wanted to show you is that I've created one user specifically to integrate my authentication proxy using Ubuntu with the Active Directory. So I could also use any other user, but for the service account, I decided to configure this user called Duo. Okay, I type an email, okay, and I created a test user, which is called Emmanuel, okay. As you can see, fair, but essentially it's Emmanuel. I configured one email, and this Emmanuel, this user belongs to domain user group and a new group I created called Duo group. Okay, this is in order for me to align with the best practices to not mix different users, and I wanted to have this as clean as possible. On the other side, looking at my dashboard for Duo, okay, this is how the Duo dashboard looks like. We need to start our configuration by using or by choosing the application with ISE or ISE as application. So here I want to show you that I have already configured, but if we want to configure one application to protect using Duo, we can just type in this case Duo. So please consider or make sure that you choose Cisco ISE Duo rather than Cisco administration, Cisco ISE administration. It's a different thing. Here, we are going to have the integration key, shared secret, API, which will be used later while we are integrated with the authentication proxy. Okay? And the rest of the configuration, I decided to leave it as it is to show you the very basic setup for me, right? Okay, next step is to go to Active Directory. In this case, I'm going to use my Active Directory and I will integrate it with my authentication proxy. Okay, and for sure, it will be integrated by Duo Cloud. So I had to add my IP address for my Active Directory. So it's IP directory, IP address that should be reachable to Duo, and using LDAP information, which is 4389. Okay. The rest of the configuration here, at least for testing purpose, it's completely the default one, and you can always test the connection between Active Directory and Duo by click on test on the portal. Okay. If you see any other sign rather than connected, that means that something was wrong and you need to troubleshoot properly. Okay. If everything goes well, which is in my case, I should be able to sync the user, especially on using my user group. Okay, here is my case. I'm using this specific user, which is Emmanuel, right? It's Emmanuel, and I'm also be able to see the email and the group that I use to sync with Duo, which is the group Duo group, right? So let's see what else is needed. Okay, I want to show you what is the current status that should get when you are configuring Duo with Active Directory. Okay, most of the documentation pointing to the fact everything about this option, about this section should be already configured. So I went ahead and show you what are the menus and what are the fields that you need to make sure to fill out in order to get the connectivity up and running. Okay, so nothing about that. The main point is to have ISE as an application, and the second part of the configuration belongs to Duo configuration file. As I said, we can also use Microsoft Windows, but in my setup in my lab, I wanted to show you how to configure it using Ubuntu, which is CLI-based server. Okay. Don't worry if you don't see many of these commands. I'm going to paste this template on my GitHub repository so that you can review it by your own and copy and paste and for sure modify with your own data from Duo. But I want to show you what are the current configuration that we need to look at every time that we need to integrate Duo with our Active Directory and on ISE. So here we have the service account username password. So you see there, you have the AD client, hence we have the IP address. We also have the username and password I use to integrate with my Active Directory. And that specific section belongs to the configuration with ISE. So here I'm using ISE IP address and the Radius shared secret, which is the one I'm also use in ISE in a moment. So the integration key and the share key is exactly what I need to use. I just need to copy paste it, like as you can see here, and that should be all. So now we are ready to configure ISE, and ISE it's going to be over external identity sources and under Radius token. So here I'm already configured, but I want to show you how easy it is to set it up. Just need to add on the new Radius token, click on connection, and first of all, you need to add the authentication proxy IP address. There is no need for me to configure the Active Directory IP address, but we need to connect to ISE with the authentication proxy. That's why I put it the IP address and set it up the shared secret. The rest of the configuration, I decided to leave it as it is. No changes on the authentication, no changes on the authorization part. Okay, this is enabled by default, and I decided to put it or to leave it as it is. The next section is to create a new identity source sequence. Here it's going to be the way that we are going to use. In my case, I decided to call it dual identity source sequence and select dual as first and my Active Directory as second. Then just click on save. Didn't change anything on the options, just save, and that's it. Okay, so far so good. In my case, I think the next step could be to review. Oh, this is very important. During my configuration, I faced a couple of issues while I was trying to connect the proxy out with my Active Directory. So please make sure and please double check that the dual security service is allowed on the Active Directory firewall. If you don't see, or if this service is not allowed, you won't connect your proxy with your Active Directory. So please be careful on that. All right. Once we have the identity source sequence, it's time to configure the command set and TACACS profile. In this case, I'm not going to use my ISE, but I'm going to use my my router. So here again, I'm using privilege 15. The reason I've chosen privilege 15 is because I want to show you that even though we have the highest level, we are able to restrict the commands. So in my case, these are all the commands, and only these commands will be allowed for the network administrator to type. We have regex, which is the second one. You have show running config, and I'm going to keep this option as disabled. That means that if there is any other command that is not in the list, it's not going to be allowed, right? And last but not least, in my case, I've configured my router. This is the IP address, and for sure you can also use network device group or any other method. In my case, I wanted to keep it simple. And under authentication policy, it is important to configure the identity source sequence. In my case, it was dual. And under authorization, well, I'm just adding the webinar command set and webinar profile as we did it with ASA, right? That's pretty much it. On TACACS, well, we are done. So let me just put it here and select those every 10 minutes, right? So we have dual configuration, we have TACACS ISE configuration done, and well, we are almost done here, right? The last part that is missing is to configure router. So let's go ahead and do it. So we have CSR, this is my CSR virtual router, okay? And let's see if we need to configure anything. I don't think so. I think we can go ahead and use my PC. Okay, this is the PC that I'm going to use to test the connectivity and to test TACACS once we are done with the configuration. So let me just log into it. Okay. Let me refresh this. Well, let's remove it. It's easier for me. So go to PuTTY and okay, we are ready to test in a moment for sure. Right. So in this case, I'm going to use this configuration, right? So it's going to be the same command. It's going to allow us 15 minutes to configure before it gets reloaded, right? And I'm going to I'm going to continue with the rest of the configuration as we did it with ASA. So the way I'm configuring is the method that I almost always use with my customers to keep in a safe place. So I'm gonna need, in terms of time, I'm gonna need to speed this up. This is the configuration pretty much. Okay, authentication, authorization, and the rest of the commands are pretty much known. Again, this configuration template will be on my GitHub repository so that you can have it as reference and play a little bit. Okay. It's time for me to test, and this is a very useful command that I always recommend you to test or to use whenever possible. This is the command that will allow you to troubleshoot and to see what's going on behind the scenes every time that you test Duo. So again, I'm gonna add it in my template on my GitHub repository, but basically what I'm going to do is to test and to see if there is something behind the scenes that could tell me if the authentication will work or not. Okay, so let me go ahead, go to 14. Let me make it a little bit bigger so we can all see. And what is going to happen is after I type my username and my password, it's Duo will prompt me for my push on Duo on my phone. And after that, it should be all, and I should be able to get into the device. Okay. So the first time didn't try, I think I had fat fingers at that time. So let me try one more time. If you see that the time is like a waiting time, that means that it is being processed. And after that, you will see the push as I see it. I put it one example, and there you go. Here we have a bunch of information. We have communication between Duo, between the authentication proxy, ISE. This is ISE IP address. And well, here you will see all the logs as you were troubleshooting an issue. So here's pretty much it. Okay. And let me speed this up a little bit. I wanted to show you one more thing. This is the show commands. As we remember, show commands was part of the show, sorry, the show running was part of the allow commands, and we are using this one. But the important command I want to show you here, let me see if I can speed this up a little bit. Let's see here, show commands. Okay, it's the okay, this one, router and ERGRP. So if we don't have the router space ERGRP, we should be able to use router command. Okay, and this router command will also give us the ability to configure any routing protocol such as OSPF, BGP, and most of the times this might not be useful for the network administrator. So one of the options to restrict this is by using regex, as I'm doing here. So in this case, I'm using router space ERGRP. Okay, give it just a name, a number, 100, and it allowed me to do so. So it's pretty much it. And if I type, for example, router OSPF 100, it doesn't allow me to do so. And the reason for that is because of the regex command. Okay, so if we are back to ISE. Okay, we are seeing one successful attempt for router ERGRP 100 and an authentication failure for OSPF. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So here we are not only seeing the option for Duo for network device administration, but we also seeing how we can use regex to restrict certain commands while allowing the rest of them. And I didn't want to finish my presentation without showing this very important slide. We have seen many questions around this topic. This topic is basically TACACS with Azure ID. Many of our customers, many of us have been migrating, or we are planning to migrate it with, I'm planning the migration with Azure ID. So here is an important slide that I encourage you to keep it handy, because it will save a lot of time if you want to configure ISE. So in this case, the takeaway is that the Azure MFA does not support RADIUS, which means we need to use TACACS, for example, between the network device and ISE. we need to use Radius between ISE and Microsoft NPS. And here is how we are going to configure. We are going to be able to use the Azure AD groups and Azure MFA for network device administration. So here is very important point. And every time that you think, or if any of your customers are looking for an option to integrate ISE, TACACS, and network devices along with Azure and Azure MFA, well, this is the way to go. And that's it. Rigo, I'm not sure if there's any question I might help to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Emmanuel. Great presentation there. I think we do have time to squeeze in maybe one, maybe two questions from our audience here. Let's see, I'm looking at our Q&A panel, and I got this question here. How often does the test user get called? It would seem that to either fill up my logs with failures or have hard-coded credentials saved in the config. Is this the recommended configuration?
Oh, okay. I just want to know, just want to confirm I understood the question correctly. How often does the username credentials build pool? Is that the question, Rigo?
I believe so. The question itself didn't really specify, just mentioned how often does a test user get called. Um,
Okay.
but yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let me try to answer this one very, very quickly. So every time that we need to log in into TACACS, into network device for TACACS, this is where we are going to see the network device will prompt us for the user credentials, so for the user information. So after we have TACACS session, we should not see any user information, but we should start seeing command authorization. Every time that we type any command on the network device, we should see the logs on TACACS live logs and see what are the commands that the user who is already authenticated is trying to type. I think that answers the question, Drew.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And final question here, does TACACS with Duo also authenticate against Azure AD?
Those TACACS, I don't know. Oh, well, it's also from my understanding, it's also possible. I would like to share the information, more information in my GitHub repository, but I think to see it is possible instead of using MFA or Azure, we can use Duo for that purpose. I think that that's possible.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think we can go ahead and wrap up our Q&A with that question and answer. And Emmanuel, I believe you got some resources that you'd like to share with the audience as well.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Riga, for reminding me to do so. So for the audience, I really encourage you to visit these links and stay tuned for the next webinars that we are going to have here. And also, I would like to share this guide where you are going to find more details about how to think or how to implement TACACS with ICE by following the best practices. And I think that's it for today.
Perfect. And actually, Emmanuel, I'm sorry, before we wrap up, we are, I think the GitHub, a lot of our audience members are asking if that would be available to share, the GitHub link. Any information you can provide about that?
Yeah, sure. Give me just one sec. I have it here. And that's the repository, my personal repository that I'm going to share the information. So I try to see okay, let me see, Rigo, please, if you can have here. Okay, I should be sharing the GitHub repository, just the one I used last time for my webinar. So you can share it with the audience, Rigo, that would be great, please.
Absolutely.
Let's just see
Yep.
if I
So for our
can.
audience, we have just posted the GitHub link for you into the chat window, so feel free to get it from there for your reference. And we're also going to be posting it into our post-webinar discussion as well for your reference, just in case you missed it from the chat window. So no worries. We'll make sure to get that link to all of you. All right. Well, Emmanuel, I just want to thank you again for speaking about this topic with our audience. I hope that everyone found great value in the information resources that were shared here today. I would also like to extend a very big thank you to each and every one of our panelists for lending a hand with the questions throughout the webinar. We really appreciate it. And for our attendees, if you do have any additional questions or would like to continue the conversation about today's topic, we encourage you to participate in our online post-webinar discussion. You are going to be redirected there upon exit, but I've also posted the link to that discussion in the chat window. So feel free to save it and refer to that link for any additional questions about today's topic. So we also look forward to your participation.